Let's take a look at the create a multiplication table test specs. So let's begin with the README, and here we have the multiplication table function that we need to create. The arguments that it accepts is rows and columns, and they are separate arguments. If we look at the example, the first argument is a row, and the second argument is a column. So we should have one row with 4 values inside of it. Now the way this kind of works is you always multiply the row by the current position you are in the column. So you'll have 1 times 1 equals 1, then 1 times 2 is 2 since we're in the second, since we are at the second number in the column, and then we're going to have 1 times 3 is 3, and 1 times 4 is 4. Let's take a look at that again, given a bigger row with 5 values in each column. So the column length will be 1 through 5. That's everything we're going to multiply by. And then we're going to multiply it by the current row that we're in. And sorry about that, I just clicked on something, but here we're back here. So we're at column 1, row 1, so we multiply 1 times 1, and the product is 1. So that's why we have 1 right here. Then we're at column 2, row 1, so we do 1 times 2, and the product is 2. And this pattern continues all the way through for the first row. Now we get to the second row. In the second row, we're in row 2, column 1, so 2 times 1 gives us 2. Now we're in the second row, in the second column, so 2 times 2, and the product is 4, and that's why this is here. Then we have row 2, column 3, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 4 is 8, and 2 times 5 is 10. Now we're in the final row. Final row, first column, 3 times 1 is 3. Second column, third row, 3 times 2 is 6, and this pattern continues all the way through the end. So now that we have a general idea of what the first argument represents and the second argument represents, let's go ahead and dive into the test specs. Let's take a look at the first test spec, returns an array. So the multiplication table function is invoked. It's passed 2 arguments. The first argument is the row, the second argument is the columns. Something is returned to table, and the expectation here tests what is returned to table. And we are making sure that an array is returned from table. Notice inside of the expectation, array.isArray, and we pass in the table variable, and this expression should return true, because multiplication table returns an array to table. So let's go ahead and create that behavior. Now you can create a standard function. I'm going to use an arrow function here. We need to define 2 parameters. The first parameter represents the row, and the second parameter is the columns. So I'm going to just call this row and column. Now just to pass this first test spec, we need to make sure multiplication table just returns an array. So we're just going to focus on the first spec. When I save this code and run our test specs with npm test, notice, let's go to our spec list, let's make sure all of them are running from multiplication table. Notice that we are passing the first spec, and by chance we're also passing the last spec, which is great, but we're not going to look at that at the moment. Now that we're passing the first spec, let's go ahead and look at the second test spec. Every row is an array, and the first argument represents the total amount of rows in the table. So if every row is an array, when 3 is passed in here, we should have 3 arrays in the array that is returned from small table. And it is a multi-dimensional array. And that's exactly what's demonstrated here in the test specs. Small table should equal this value. So it's an array with 3 nested arrays inside of it, because these arrays represent individual rows. Columns, we don't have any individual values for the columns yet, so everything is 0, and these arrays are empty. For a median table, notice the value 6 is passed into multiplication table. So the value returned here is a multi-dimensional array, and there are 6 nested arrays inside of it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this pattern also continues for a large table as well. Everything here is working the same. So there's a relationship between the first argument passed in, which represents rows, and the amount of arrays that should be pushed inside of the array that we are returning. So what I want to do is create a for loop. And with this for loop, we're going to loop the amount of times that is passed into as the first argument, and create an array to push into the array that we are returning for every single pass of the loop. So instead of just returning this array, I want to give it a label so I can always reference it. So I'm going to create it and call it times table. And now I will create that loop. which is going to have a direct relationship with the first argument, rows. So for, let's say, let I equal 0, while I is less than row, I plus plus. And now inside of this loop, all I want to do is push a new array into times table. So I'll say times table dot push, and we're going to push an empty array inside of it. Now all we have to do is return times table. So I'll save this code, and let's see if we're passing that second test spec. So we go to the spec list. Notice the second test spec is now green. So let's move on to the third spec. In a 1x3 grid, rows by columns, the column values start at 1 and increment by 1. So notice on line 21, multiplication table is invoked, and the arguments passed in is 1 and 3. So we should have one nested array with 3 individual values inside of it, 1, 2, and 3. And that's what's represented in our expectation. So how could we begin this format? Well, right now we have one for loop, which is responsible for the new row. And what I want to do then is create another nested for loop that is responsible for the values inside of the row, or the columns, the products of each individual value that we're putting inside of the first row. So how can we create that behavior? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is, instead of this having an unnamed array that we're pushing inside of times table, when we step inside of this loop, I want to create a new array. So here, I'm going to create a new variable, and for now, I'll just call it rows. Actually, you know what? I want to call this row, and I want to rename my parameter values to rows and column. So that means while I is less than rows, now I'm going to have an individual row, which is this array. Now what I want to do is create a for loop that will populate the values we put inside of this row. So here I'll do something like for, let's say j equals 0, while j is less than columns, j plus plus. Okay, this looks pretty good so far. And what do I have to do inside of here? Well, I need to push individual values into our row array. So let's see. I'm not going to have a 0 case. So instead of having j equals 0, let's have j start at 1. And here we'll have row dot push j. So we'll have 1 pushed in, 2 pushed in, and hopefully 3 pushed in. Then when we exit the nested loop, we're going to push not this empty array anymore, the populated row array. Now hopefully this works. There might be a small adjustment we have to make, but let's go ahead and try it out. Here I went ahead and saved our code, and let's go ahead and make sure we're running all of our specs, which we are. Notice we're still failing this third test spec here. So let's go ahead and click on it and see what's happening. It expected, and this is our output, our return value. It's a nested array, so that's our row that we're creating, but it's only adding 1 and 2 into there instead of 1, 2, and 3. So to me, that's probably something that we messed up with when we created our nested for loop. It's just not aligning correctly. And if we tab over, let's go ahead and inspect this nested for loop. So notice j starts at 1. So when j is less than columns, and columns, for this example, starts at 3, while 1 is less than 3, we step into our nested loop, we push in the current value of j, which is 1. So that works. Then we increment j, it's 2, while 2 is less than 3. We step inside of our loop, we push 2 inside of it, and then we increment j, and now we're at 3. So while 3 is less than columns, but columns is the value 3, well, we break out of the loop here. So what we can do here is just say, while j is less than or equal to columns, continue. So I think we fixed our off by 1 error here in our loop. So let's go ahead and save this and see if we're passing that third test spec now, which we currently are. So this is a great sign. So we're passing the first 3 test specs, and randomly we're passing the last test spec. Let's take a look at the fourth spec. In a 2x3 grid, rows by columns, the column values start at 1 and are multiplied by the current row. So with the pattern here, rows is 2, columns is 3. Then we invoke our multiplication table function and we pass in 2 and 3. So right now, I believe we're only doing something like we're only going through 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Right? That's what we're pushing inside of our each individual row. Let's go ahead and test that out. We're going to look at what our current output is. And that's exactly correct here. For each individual row, we're just pushing in the values 1, 2, 3, and then we're pushing in the values 1, 2, 3. What we have to do instead is create a product and push the product inside of each individual row. So what we want to do is we want to multiply I by j. But we have a problem because I starts at 0, and we're skipping the 0 case. So we can make a quick adjustment to that. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, while I is 1, I is less than or equal to rows. Now inside of here, we have to create the product for each individual item inside of our row. So I'm going to create a console log, and I'm going to say something like this. I times j, and just the way console log works here, we have to separate these by commas. And then I'll say equals I times j. And this value is the value we have to push inside of our row array. So we're just going to do I times j. So let's go ahead and save this, and hopefully it's a little clearer after we actually log this out. And I was just getting an error here. I can read it down here. I've missed a comma. So now everything's looking a little bit better. And we're passing that second test spec, which is great, but I want to make sure you can visualize it. So what's the arguments that are being currently executed in this 2x3 grid pattern here? Rows is 2, columns is 3. So this is the expected output that we are expecting. And when we look at our logs, we're in the first row, in the first column, so we do 1 times 1, and we get 1. So this is the value pushed into the 0th index of that row array. Then we're in the first row, the second column, 1 times 2, and we get 2. Then we have 1 times 3, and we get 3. Now we're done executing all of the columns because that's the argument that was passed in. We only have to go up to 3 columns. Now we just repeat the pattern, but instead of multiplying by 1, because we were in the first row before, we're now multiplying by 2. So we're in the second row, the first column, so we have 2 times 1, and we get 2. Now we increment to the second column, so we have 2 times 2, which gives us 4, and then we have 2 times 3, which gives us 6. Now, I think we should be passing the next test spec, because the next test spec is just giving us a different scenario when we multiply multiplication table, or when we invoke multiplication table. There's a different rows argument and a different columns argument, but the pattern should work exactly the same. And we established that pattern here. So I'm going to just exit out, or I'm sorry, I'm going to clear that console log statement that I had. I'm going to save everything again. And let's see if we're passing the second test, the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th test spec as well. And really, I think we might be passing all the specs, which we currently are. So what's the key takeaway from this problem? The key takeaway problem is to make sure you have a great understanding of looping and especially how nested loops work. We have one loop here, which is responsible for our rows and iterating over our rows. And then we have a second loop, which is responsible for iterating over the columns. If you are not too sure on how the multiplication table function is operating, I highly suggest reviewing this problem. It's a very common problem, and it's very common to have to work with nested arrays. Nested loops, and we're also kind of working with nested arrays here because we have the multidimensional arrays. If you're stuck at all, here's a tip. Inside of your nested loop, place a debugger statement inside of it. Save it, and since we have testum running in the background, we can go into our test specs and inspect what's currently happening. Here, notice the argument passed in for rows is 5 and columns is 10. And if we try to find the test spec that has that, it's our very first test spec here. But we don't necessarily want to run this first spec. We want to maybe run the 3rd spec or the 4th spec. So to do that, let's just close out of our test specs and pick one that will give us a good visual. such as in a 2x3 grid. Now we can go ahead and open up our our console, and now if we refresh this page, notice we're paused in the debugger. The argument passed in the rows is 2 and columns is 3. So we are in this test spec right here, and we're invoking this multiplication table. Now if we look inside of this, we can step through it, and we're inside of our nested loop right now. So notice the current value of I is, when we hover over it, it's 1, and the current value of j is 1, because we're in the first row, the first column. You can also use some of the debugger tools on your right-hand side to get a visual of each individual variable that we're working with. So notice what happens when I go through the next step. We push whatever value 1 times 1 evaluates to into our row array. And now if we look over here, notice our row variable has 1 in it. Now as we continue stepping through this for loop, we're in the nested for loop still because we haven't broken out of that loop yet. So we're going to increment j. So now j is 2. So we're going to multiply 1 times 2. So when we get to our push method here, notice the expression 1 times 2. So once again, we're going to evaluate that expression, and it's pushed into the row array. And notice inside of our row array it has 1 and 2. This pattern continues, so we'll increment j. Now j is 3, which is also the max column length. So we're going to multiply 1 times 3. That value is pushed into our row array, which we can see right here. We have 1, 2, and 3. And now what's going to happen? Well, when we increment j is going to go from 3 to 4. And we're going to break out of our for loop now, because now with j at 4, columns is at 3, we break out of our nested loop, and we jump down into into the next portion of code that we have to run, which is in our outer loop. And what happens in our outer loop? Well, we push the row that we just populated into our times table array, which is empty right now. See, notice times table here is empty, but row is fully populated. And now when we step through this line of code, notice times table. Times table has an array inside of it, which represents the values of our first row. And now this pattern just continues, right? Our outer loop has a check. It increments I. It evaluates this expression. Is 2 less than or equal to 2? Yes, it is 2. So we step inside of this. We create a new row array. And now we enter our nested loop. And once again, this pattern just continues. Now the value of I is 2, and we're on the very first column. So this continues, and you can continue stepping through the steps into debugger to help yourself visualize how this operates. So I highly suggest going through these steps if you're struggling making a visual connection to how this code is operating. You'll definitely see nested loops more and more and more, and they're a very common interview question. So hopefully you got a good few takeaways from this video, and we'll see you in the next solution video.